This podcast features criminologists discussing sensitive themes and topics. Listener discretion is advised.
A young woman is killed after her attacker reveals that he wanted her dead. This landmark case would forever change the legal duties of mental health professionals. This is the Tatiana Tarasoff story. Good morning, Meghan.
Good morning, Amy. I just want you to know that I already heard a landmark case, and I'm like excited about it. Because I hear landmark, I think about what's the legal precedent.
Yes.
What am I going to learn from this episode? So I'm already in.
So does that mean you've never heard of the Tarasoff ruling?
You know, I know the name, and I probably will know it when you say it, but offhand, I can't. I just can't.
Okay, can't place it.
I can't place it offhand. Not yet.
So this case is pretty old. We're talking about the events happened in the late 60s. The rulings happened in the early 70s. But this case changed the field of psychology and social work in many states. I actually learned about it in graduate school because, you know, I got my master's in forensic psychology. So this was like forensic psychology 101. And recently when I taught forensic psychology last semester, I covered this case over, it took us like 2 weeks to really get through all of the details. I tried to cut it down a little bit, so we won't be here for that long, but...
I know what the issue is. I just have no idea where it originated from, which is, like, for me, exciting to learn about.
And I would bet that our listeners who are mental health professionals know this case because it probably affects their daily work, and they probably learned about it in school as well. So I'm interested to hear from our listeners about how this ruling affects their day-to-day.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my goodness. Can't wait.
Okay, let's meet the woman at the center of today's case. Tatiana Tarasoff, or Tanya as she is known. In fact, I'll refer to her as Tanya throughout this case because that's what you'll hear her referred to mostly. Tanya was born on January 22nd, 1949 in China. And that's where her parents, Vitaly and Lydia Tarasoff, had met after they fled Russia during the Russian Revolution. Her brother Alex was born soon after, and the family moved to Brazil for some time before finally settling in Berkeley, California. And that was when Tanya was about 10 years old. She also had a sister who was born shortly after they moved there. Some reports say Tanya had a tumultuous relationship with her father, but other than that, she seemed to have a normal upbringing, and she was described as being a shy child, but very determined. At the time of the events we are discussing, Tanya was 18 years old and had been attending Merritt College, which is a junior college in Oakland, California. And she planned to transfer to the University of California, Berkeley, the following year. In the fall of 1968, Tanya and a friend attended a folk dancing class at the International House on Berkeley's campus. Have you ever heard of the International House?
No, I have not heard of it.
I hadn't heard of it either. It's also known as the I House, and it was and still is a residency program for graduate students and young professionals from around the world. And it's built on the idea that living in a diverse community builds cross-cultural understanding. And I think this is awesome. So basically, It's a place where all the students from different backgrounds gather. And from what I understand, Tanya had attended these dance classes because she was tutoring somebody who lived in the I House, so she had ties to the house. During this class, this is where she met a young man named Prosenjit Podar, and he was a graduate student at Berkeley. He was an exchange student from Bengal, India, and he had a really tough upbringing, as he was born into the Harijan caste. Have you heard of this?
No.
Again, neither have I. That's why I love doing these episodes, because I learn so much. The Harijan describes people in India who are considered the lowest caste. In fact, they're even seen as lower than the lowest caste. They are known as the untouchables. And sometimes you hear untouchables and you think of a positive connotation, but here the untouchables is a very negative label. And these individuals carried out miserable tasks that were associated with disease and pollution. So they would clean up after funerals, they would deal with sewage, and work with animal skin.
Okay.
And the Harijan lived in extreme poverty and faced intense degradation and discrimination. Now, Prosenjit was one of what you could say the lucky ones who was able to come to America for an educational opportunity. So normally when you're born into this caste, you stay there and you don't have opportunity.
Right.
But his parents fought for him. So now back to that night at the I House. When Prosenjit saw Tanya, he was immediately interested in her, and he actually says it was love at first sight. And she was pretty friendly to him as well, but she was not interested romantically.
Okay.
They continued to see each other at the weekly dance classes, and they hung out a few times, but they did not have the same ideas about these hangouts. While Prosenjit saw them as dates, Tanya just saw them as hanging out with a friend. The two even had a brief kiss on New Year's Eve, and for him, this cemented the idea that these two were in a serious relationship.
Oh.
And this could be cultural differences that are likely to blame, because Prosenjit did not have a lot of interaction with females. In his culture, courting and relationships happen very differently than they happen here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Prosenjit was smitten to the point where he started preparing for marriage.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But again, Tanya saw this relationship as platonic, and it began to unnerve her when he started showing up at her house, and he even would follow her on occasion.
Yeah, that would unnerve most people.
And she made it very clear that she was not romantically interested. In fact, she even told him about other people that she was seeing. But as a result of these rebuffs, Prosenjit experienced a severe emotional crisis. He became depressed. He started neglecting his appearance. He started neglecting his studies, and he was a very good student. He wasn't showering. He spent days in bed. He would also speak disjointly, and he often cried.
Does he have a roommate or anyone around who's taking note of these changes? Just wondering.
Yeah, so he didn't have a big group of friends, but he certainly had a few friends, and he did have a roommate. He actually told a friend that he was in love with Tanya and thought about killing her, in particular by blowing up her room. And he told this friend that he could not control himself. Now, it's unclear, though unlikely, that this friend took any action or told anyone. Perhaps they thought it was a joke. Who knows? We've seen this in so many other cases. I think we need to tell the children in our lives that we always need to take threats seriously.
Yeah, you just covered Jennifer Crumbly, but, you know, in the school shooter cases, we see that this is a common theme as well, that they told someone ahead of time that they were going to do it, which, you know, you've said before, doesn't mean that it's anyone's fault who was told that. It just kind of stresses the importance of teaching children, right, to say something if you see something, which doesn't mean that we blame the person that was told. I think there's a different lesson here. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think the lesson is telling our children or the children in our lives that if they hear any type of threat, anyone talking about self-harm or harming others, they need to tell someone. Even if they think it's a joke, it's not for children to decide what threats are real and what aren't.
Right.
So Prosenjit's condition persisted with steady deterioration throughout the spring and into the summer of 1969. He continued to contact Tanya, and the two would even see each other on occasion throughout this time. And sometimes he would tape record their conversations unbeknownst to Tanya, and then he would replay them to try to figure out why she didn't like him and why she didn't want to be with him. Again, all of this behavior is red flags.
Did Tanya feel threatened? Because I know that you said he followed her, but did she feel threatened at this point? She's still seeing him. Maybe she felt bad for him, but I wonder if she also felt nervous.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't get the impression from what I read that she felt like there was any real threat.
Okay.
It's possible she did confide in people in her life, but it certainly wasn't clear that she was scared at this time.
Okay.
Remember, we're also talking about the late 60s. I don't think stalking and domestic violence and threats were really something that we knew what to do with.
Nope.
Now, while Prosenjit fell deeper into his dangerous depression, Tanya went on a trip to Brazil that summer to visit family. And during the same time, at the urging of his friends, Prosenjit sought help from a Berkeley psychologist to help him deal with his emotions. And this was a good time because Tanya wasn't in the picture. So it's good that his friends are urging him. I think his friends are noticing that things are not going well.
Yeah.
On August 18th, 1969, Prosenjit saw Dr. Lawrence Moore at UC Berkeley's Cowell Memorial Hospital. Throughout several therapy sessions, Prosenjit confided that he had thought about killing. And although he never identified specifically who he wanted to kill, he did say it was a girl who is currently in Brazil. This is very concerning, and it was very easy to find out who he was talking about, because while he didn't explicitly say it was Tanya, he often spoke about his love interest during the sessions he had with the doctor.
Right.
Now, the doctor did what he was supposed to do, or the doctor did what I think any of us would do. He reported the information to the UC Berkeley campus police, and he asked that they detain Prosenjit because he believed that Prosenjit was suffering from paranoid schizophrenic delusions.
Okay.
And as a result of this information, campus police detained Prosenjit, but they also released him shortly after because they say he appeared entirely rational. Now, this is problematic, and more so because Dr. Moore even informed them that He often presented as rational, but he was very sick and in need of help. So basically, the police spoke with him and they were like, oh, this doesn't look like a, quote, crazy person. We'll let him go.
Right.
The officers, before letting him go, though, the officers elicited a verbal promise from him that he would try to stay away from Tanya.
I mean, that's not really sufficient, but this is also way prior to our acknowledgement of mental health issues. Certainly, we know now that police officers aren't necessarily trained or equipped to deal with serious mental health issues. So I can't imagine then what the situation was.
Yeah, I think it was definitely a sign of the times. But Dr. Moore was going through all of the correct motions because on that same day, Dr. Moore wrote a letter to the chief of campus police, William Beale, stating that Prosenjit Podar suffered from paranoid schizophrenic reaction, acute and severe, and that he was a danger to himself and others. Dr. Moore further stated that if the campus police would pick Prosenjit up and transfer him to a nearby hospital, then Dr. Moore would sign a 72-hour emergency detention order.
Oh, okay. So I was going to ask what could be done here. So that makes perfect sense.
Yes.
Yep.
And this is also known as a civil commitment that we've covered in other episodes.
Yep.
Even Dr. Moore's psychiatric supervisor concurred in Dr. Moore's diagnosis, and he also agreed that Prosenjit needed to be hospitalized. So far, so good. However, when another supervisor, Dr. Harvey Paulson, who was the director of psychiatry at Cowell Memorial Hospital, so he's two above Dr. Moore.
Okay.
When he learned of the attempt to institute the 72-hour emergency detention, he requested that Chief Beale return Dr. Moore's letter, and he ordered Moore to destroy all copies of the letter and all of his therapist's notes on Prosenjit.
What?
Wait, I'm not done yet before you react. In addition, Dr. Paulson ordered his staff to take no further action to place Prosenjit in a 72-hour treatment and evaluation facility. And I have to say, it's unclear why he took such extreme actions. Maybe he was afraid of violating the rights of Prosenjit, or maybe he really thought that this young man was not a threat.
Did he think just that the treating psychiatrist broke protocol here and broke confidentiality and was concerned about covering up that?
I think that could be. We'll get into a big discussion about that. That's not clear, but I think it's a valid hypothesis.
I can't think of anything else. Destroying the records too?
That's
oh my
very
goodness.
strange. To me, that was the stranger part of it. Unfortunately, Prosenjit also stopped seeing his doctor at this time because it would later be revealed that besides the steps that Dr. Moore took behind the scenes, he also advised Prosenjit that if the death threats continued, he would have no choice but to hospitalize him.
Yeah.
So, of course, Prosenjit just stops going to therapy then.
Right.
Meanwhile, Tanya returned from her travels to Brazil in October, unbeknownst that she was the named victim in Prosenjit's delusions. Just a side note, while Tanya was away in Brazil, Prosenjit befriended Tanya's brother, and for a short time, the two lived together.
Wow.
So he's really inserting himself into Tanya's life, and Tanya's brother had no idea what was brewing.
That's extremely calculated, too.
On October 27th, 1969, Prosenjit went to Tanya's home to speak to her. However, at the time she was not home, and her mother had asked him to leave. He did leave. However, he returned later that same day, but this time he was armed with a pellet gun and a kitchen knife.
Oh, my goodness.
And unfortunately, this time Tanya was home, and she was alone.
Ugh.
Tanya refused to speak to him. I think at this point she sees the escalation. She told him to leave, and when he persisted, she screamed. This is when he shot her with the pellet gun, and Tanya ran from her home. But Prosenjit caught her in the yard and stabbed her over a dozen times. And this was to the horror of neighbors who had bared witness to this attack. Prosenjit then calmly returned to the house and called the police, telling them that he had stabbed Tanya and asked that he be handcuffed.
Okay. So he understands what he did. Yes.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that indicates that he knows the wrongfulness of his actions because he immediately called the police.
It reminds me of Andrea Yates' case. Just that part, because after Andrea Yates drowned her children, she called her husband and said, you need to come home. She explained what she had done.
And as we'll talk about later on, these actions that sometimes defendants take sometimes complicate the rulings of their mental state.
Sure. Yeah.
Sadly, Tanya succumbed to her injuries the day of the attack. Prosenjit was arrested and examined by Dr. Kermit Gruberg, a Berkeley Police Department psychiatrist, and this doctor confirmed the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. Prosenjit entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. This is also known as NGRI, and it's essentially a plea that is used by criminal defendants who admit to the crime, so it's an affirmative defense, but they claim that they lack the mental capacity to commit it because they were mentally ill at the time. This defense has also been known as the mental disorder defense, and it can result in confinement in a psychiatric facility for an undetermined amount of time. While awaiting trial, Prosenjit was also examined by Dr. Wilmer Anderson, and this was a neurologist who was hired by the defense. He testified that on the basis of several tests that he ran, that there were organic abnormalities in Prosenjit's brain.
Oh, okay.
Over the 3-week trial, several doctors for the defense testified that Prosenjit was legally insane. Legally insane is a legal construct and not a diagnosis. You will not find it in the DSM. Although this doctor said he was legally insane, he also said that he was a paranoid schizophrenic. And that, of course, is an actual diagnosis.
So that's the diagnosis. I mean, that's kind of how I explain it to my students. That's the diagnosis that qualifies him for the insanity claim, the legal insanity claim.
Yes. I mean, there was a court-appointed psychiatrist who testified that he was not a paranoid schizophrenic and that he could understand the duty the law placed upon him.
Right.
So similar to what you were just getting at, just because an individual has a mental illness, that does not mean that they are not legally culpable or that they are legally insane.
Yep.
You can have one without the other.
Sure.
It's possible that you can have a diagnosis of, say, paranoid schizophrenia, but still understand that murder is wrong. And this sounds a lot like a case you just brought up a few minutes ago.
Yes, the Andrea Yates case. Absolutely. Andrea Yates did, in fact, know what she was doing was wrong, but she had such an illness, she had postpartum psychosis, that it really prevented her from being able to conform her actions. So she truly believed that her children were being inhabited by the devil and that the only thing she could do as a good mother to save them was to kill them. And even though she knew it was wrong, that was superseded by her desire to be a good mother and to save her children.
Do you remember what episode that was, in case listeners want to go back?
Andrea Yates was a supporter-only episode, so it was exclusive to our supporters.
And listeners could find exclusive episodes as an Apple subscriber or on Patreon. During Dr. Moore's testimony, the details of Prosenjit's threats against Tanya and the attempt to secure an emergency commitment were revealed. Many reports indicate that this was likely the first time that Tanya's family heard these facts. In other words, her family had no idea that there were warning signs. Can you imagine sitting in the trial?
No.
And realizing that your daughter's death could have been prevented and it was actually attempted to be prevented by one particular doctor?
No, I already want to know what happened to him, so I cannot imagine the shock and the anger that I would feel.
To the family's relief, Prosenjit's insanity plea did not prevail, and the jury convicted him of murder in the second degree.
Okay.
Now, I'm not sure if this has to do with the legal definitions, but I see a lot of evidence for a first-degree charge here. It was clearly premeditated, I think, but for some reason the evidence didn't support that.
It could be so many factors. It could also be the jury and somewhat split the baby, right? Like they felt sorry for him a little bit. You have no idea what happened in their deliberations or what their jury instructions were.
Actually, it's funny you bring that up. Jury instructions will become a very important part of this case. Before we get to that, as most defendants do, he appealed his decision on multiple grounds. So in 1972, the Court of Appeals heard the case, and they focused on jury instructions. They said that there is a failure to instruct the jury properly. In other words, they said the jury should have been told, quote, if you find that his mental capacity was diminished to the extent that you have a reasonable doubt whether he did harbor malice aforethought, you cannot find him guilty of murder in either the first or the second degree.
Okay.
So essentially, this is saying that the jury was not informed that they could not find him guilty unless they were certain that he intended to kill Tanya.
Okay.
Because of this failure, the court reduced Prosenjit's conviction from murder in the second degree to manslaughter.
Wow.
Shocking, right?
Really?
And they remanded the case to the trial court for resentencing.
Wow. Okay. That's kind of surprising, the actual action they took, instead of remanding it or reversing it. It's interesting.
Yeah, there's a few more surprises coming your way, Meghan.
Okay.
Because only 2 years later, the California Supreme Court vacated the judgment of the appeals court, holding that instructions given by the trial court, quote, failed to serve the needs of the jurors to understand and properly apply the evidence of diminished capacity to the underlying issues. So the court concluded that there was an error and it was prejudicial, and they remanded the case for retrial. So they were not satisfied with commuting the charges. They wanted a whole new retrial.
Yeah, they didn't think that that ruling went far enough to rectify what they feel was a real harm. Okay. Whoa.
Well, again, you're going to be even more shocked because rather than go through another, what they said, a lengthy trial, which I want to say it was only 3 weeks, which is not a lengthy trial for a murder charge, but using the excuse that they did not want to go through another lengthy trial, after serving about 5 years in prison, the state released Prosenjit.
No.
Yeah. The only condition was that he immediately leave for India and not return to the United States.
I was going to ask if they deported him, so okay.
So let me repeat this. After only serving 5 years for the brutal murder of Tatiana Tarasoff, Prosenjit was left to go back to his home country of India. And by many reports, he went on to live a pretty happy life, got married to an attorney, and possibly even had children. Sadly, life didn't go on so easy for Tanya's family.
No, of course not.
In 1973, Tanya's parents, Vitaly and Lydia, filed wrongful death suits against the university and the psychotherapists who were involved in the case.
Yep.
They alleged 4 causes of action. Now, the first was directed against the therapist's failure to detain Prosenjit. The second was against the therapist's failure to warn the Tarasoffs that Prosenjit had posed a grave danger to Tanya.
Mm-hmm.
The third was directed at Dr. Paulson and sought punitive damages for his actions following the other therapist's attempt at a 74-hour emergency detention.
Mm-hmm.
In regards to Paulson's actions, they say they were characterized as, quote, malicious and oppressive abandonment of a dangerous patient. The fourth and final cause was titled Breach of Primary Duty to Patient and the Public, and this essentially involved the same allegations as the first cause.
Mm-hmm.
Again, neither Tanya nor her parents were informed that Prosenjit had revealed a very specific intention to harm her, and many believe that this tragedy could have been prevented.
Well, it could have. I'm with those many.
I agree. However, Alameda County Superior Court did not rule in their favor, stating that they could find no special relationship between the defendants and Tanya or her parents, and therefore there was no duty to warn. The court also ruled that Dr. Paulson had no duty to commit Prosenjit, and even if he did, such action was discretionary and protected under statute.
What about the malicious acts of his boss?
No, all 4 claims were dismissed.
Okay, well, we know this went further, so that's...
It did go much further. The Tarasoffs appealed this decision, and in March of 1974, it was ruled that the campus police could be found liable for a failure to warn Tanya. It just seems like they're going back and forth. Who's going to take the fall for this?
It also doesn't seem like the campus police are the appropriate people to place the blame on here, especially if we're looking for some type of systematic change.
I agree. And actually, law enforcement was not happy with this decision, and the medical community wasn't happy with this decision.
Yeah.
Because the ruling meant that police and even suggested that mental health professionals were obligated to warn potential victims.
Right.
However, in March of 1975, there was yet another rehearing, and it would drop all liability from all parties.
So at that point, nobody is responsible but Prosenjit.
That is correct.
Okay.
Except that the second decision in 1975 provided therapists greater latitude to, quote, protect intended victims rather than warn as the only alternative. But it was not made clear how this would be done.
Yeah, that was my next question. Okay.
So now, finally, this would all be altered in the 1976 California Supreme Court decision, widely known as Tarasoff 2. In this case, the court concluded that the therapist could not escape liability because Tanya herself was not their patient. Now, the court specifically held the following. The first point, when a therapist determines, or by the standards of the profession should determine, that his patient presents a serious danger of violence to another, he incurs an obligation to use reasonable care to protect the intended victim against such danger. And the second, the discharge of this duty may require the therapist to take one or more of various steps, and this would depend on the nature of the case. So this may call for him to warn the intended victim or others who are likely to apprise the victim of the danger. This could also mean to notify the police or to take any other necessary steps needed under the circumstances. So basically, the original 1974 Tarasoff decision mandated warning the threatened individual, but the 1976 rehearing called for a duty to protect the intended victim, which could include, but doesn't have to include, warning the potential victim.
So this is where duty to protect comes from.
Yeah.
And this is when there is a specific and specified intended victim.
Yes, and this is a little subjective. So things are still not perfect, but at least the court's realizing that mental health professionals do have a duty to protect. So essentially, the court upheld that therapists should have warned Tanya of the danger posed by Prosenjit, and that the university could be held liable for failing to implement policies to protect Tanya. However, the court did not elaborate on the different duties to protect. They didn't characterize the specific nature or circumstances for which cases would mandate protection of a potential victim. So all the policy really states is that mental health professionals have a duty to protect potential victims when they become aware of a serious threat of violence. But what does serious mean? What does a threat mean? These are all questions we're going to grapple with.
This is also what happens in the courts a lot when they give these rulings. Oftentimes there's these vague terms like reasonable or likelihood.
Yep.
And then vague terms kind of are what give litigators work to do, right?
Yep.
Figuring out, determining in the courts then what is meant by that.
Now, about 10 years later, in 1985, there was new legislation that would recodify the Tarasoff rule. At this point, California law was improved to state that a psychotherapist has the duty to protect or warn a third party only if the therapist actually believed or predicted that the patient posed a serious risk of inflicting bodily injury upon a reasonably identifiable victim. Now, I just said a mouthful, but all these terms are very important because we're looking at if a therapist believed or predicted, very subjective, that the patient posed a serious risk of inflicting serious bodily injury, again, subjective, upon a reasonably identifiable victim. So it could be argued that since he never named Tanya, that she was not an identifiable victim. So this gives a lot of freedom for mental health professionals to push back. This clearly narrowed the applicability of the Tarasoff rule. You still see the Tarasoff rule being litigated and changed. There were actually 2 lawsuits from a murder-suicide case in the early 2000s in which they narrowed Tarasoff even a little more. And the new decision at that point ruled that psychotherapists needed to give careful thought to handling threats reportedly made by a patient, but revealed to them by a relative of the patient. So now it took it a step further.
Right.
And said that if a relative reveals that they know somebody who might harm somebody, now mental health professionals also have the duty to protect in that situation as well. The current law in California states that if a therapist fails to take the steps to protect a potential victim from a patient who has made a specific threat, the therapist can be found negligent. So warning the victim may play a key role in protecting them. Again, there is no longer a specific duty to warn. Duty to warn could be one of the many steps of duty to protect, but duty to warn is not explicit.
Okay. Interesting. Wow. I had no idea there was such an extensive history too.
Yeah. And some say this protective duty overrides concerns about maintaining patient confidentiality. Because to complete their protective duty, the therapist is expected to make reasonable efforts to communicate the threat, and this could be to victims or law enforcement. So I can understand how this could impede maybe the practice of mental health professionals.
Sure.
Okay, so why was the Tarasoff rule so important to the criminal justice system? Well, because prior to this case, mental health professionals considered the confidentiality of their clients to be crucial, and they were to protect their clients' privacy and information at all costs. But through the Tarasoff rule, that has all changed.
Right.
It's really changed the way that mental health professionals go about their day-to-day business. And the rule has gone through so many policy updates that mental health professionals are required to know what the current ruling is, because there's also many state differences. And then something else I failed to mention, this could become an issue because some mental health professionals say that they simply stop seeing a patient who may present this possibility. And then you have somebody who is having homicidal thoughts who are left to their own devices.
Yeah, that's the downside of this type of legislation. And it's confusing.
There's always going to be a downside, right? While this Tarasoff case was in California, This case had an impact on mental health professionals across the United States.
Yeah.
In fact, the duty to warn was adopted by numerous states and jurisdictions in the wake of the Tarasoff ruling, with 29 states adopting either a duty to warn and or a duty to protect. 17 states have what's known as permissive duty to warn and or protect, which allows leeway in the form of disclosure or consultation with colleagues or attorneys in the case of uncertainty. The ruling also had a significant effect on the training of mental health professionals. Many training programs today incorporate additional legal and ethical considerations. Despite these positive steps, research conducted in the first 20 years after the Tarasoff ruling found that although many therapists were aware of the case, there was substantial misinformation regarding the extent of the given state's laws and whether it required therapists to merely warn an authority or take other steps to protect a potential victim.
I could see that as being one of the problems here.
Yes. There has been an increase in mandated ethics and forensic education as part of graduate training or continuing education requirements. So up-and-coming mental health professionals, they spend a lot of time talking about these issues.
That's great.
But the question remains, how do you decide whether a patient's threats are serious enough to warrant action? There are some ways to assess seriousness, right? Is the threat clear and imminent? Is the patient able to carry out the threat? Has the patient engaged in preparatory action, such as buying a weapon or rehearsing a planned attack? And is the intended victim identifiable? This information is not always available, though, so that one's tricky. You know, people might express violent fantasies, but have no intention of following through with them.
Sure. And what better place to discuss them than with your therapist?
Now, past behavior is said to be the best predictor of future behavior, but relying solely on that is clearly inaccurate because Prosenjit had no history of violent behavior. In fact, quite the opposite. He was described as a shy and gentle-mannered guy.
I'd like to point out also that we know anecdotally from our own research that predictions of future dangerousness are very hard and are not reliable. People are just not able to do them. I mean, studies show maybe 50% of the time, there's no exact science to it.
There isn't. So then on the other hand, though, should we civilly commit everyone who makes a threat?
Right.
And this is where the difficult question emerges. How do you balance public safety and patient care / confidentiality? And this is kind of similar to another question that we also grapple with when we talk about balancing public safety with individual civil liberties. Okay, Meghan, did the system get it right?
Oh, gosh.
This is a difficult one.
I mean, you have a young girl who died when there was a credible threat, a credible warning, and it could have been prevented. And it seems to me like nobody was really held responsible. So, no, that was a failure, I think. One that we look at, and hindsight is 2020, but for me, it's much clearer on this one. This definitely could have been prevented all round. It's a true tragedy in every aspect.
I agree.
Whether or not what the rulings are going forward, I fundamentally believe, just so you know, in the duty to protect. I do believe you just gave a list of criteria, which I think is a very good list. It's a good starting place. And I do believe that there are ways to ascertain or to determine who might be more credible than others. I also don't believe it's the majority of people going to see a psychiatrist who have homicidal thoughts. So we have to also keep it in that perspective that we're not talking about the masses and determining who's violent in the masses in that regard, in that extreme regard. So I do believe in the fundamental right. I don't know what the right terminology is. This is why I'm not a lawyer. There's no perfect way to make this legislation, but fundamentally, I believe in it.
I'd like to read a quote by one of the justices who wrote the majority of the Tarasoff opinion, and this is Justice Matthew O. Tobriner. He said, quote, "The public policy favoring protection of the confidential character of patient psychotherapist communications must yield to the extent to which disclosure is essential to avert danger to others. The protective privilege ends where the public peril begins." And I think that perfectly sums this up. I'm going to say it again because it gives me the chills. And I think it's perfect. The protective privilege ends where the public peril begins. So that question about the balancing act, I think he sums it up great here. There have been many opponents who argue that this ruling erodes the practice. And there's been a lot of controversy over the circumstances for breaching confidentiality. But again, I think when there is a clear, credible threat And I think erring on the side of caution is the way to go because you're talking about somebody's life.
We have so many of these issues come up in our cases about how to balance the rights of individuals versus public safety. And oftentimes public safety and specific individual safety does trump all else. And there is good reason for that. And I see that this case is such a clear example of why we need to be concerned about protecting the safety of potential victims.
And just to close out, as far as theories that can help us understand Prosenjit's action, I think there's a few. It's important to acknowledge the cultural differences, but that in this case, there was definitely a mental illness. There was a biological abnormality.
Yes. Oftentimes the two are connected, right? I think we're talking about a biological abnormality that unfortunately impacted his state of mental health and created other conditions. Yeah, I mean, I thought I saw that pretty clearly as well.
And for him also, it was building, the strain of not having his love interest. And it sounds like it kind of came to a head where he was realizing that she was not responding to his advances.
Right.
If you're interested in learning more about the difference between the duty to warn and the duty to protect, and different states and the different roles and responsibilities of mental health professionals, we're going to add a link in our show notes to a document that's on apaservices.org. And they also include additional references and resources. If you're interested, that's a great resource.
Great episode, Amy. I learned so much in this episode. I only understood this as one individual kind of concept. I did not understand the layers and the evolution of this ruling. So well done. Thank you.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing from our listeners again at how this affects their work, because I know a lot of our listeners work in the mental health field. Before we go today, Meghan, we have a question.
Oh, okay.
This question from a supporter is, will you be doing any meetups or live shows anytime soon?
I love that question.
I do too. And this is something we've been talking about for years. I'm going to say yes and yes. I love meeting our listeners. We have met some listeners at academic conferences or sometimes just in the wild, right? What do you think, Meghan?
We definitely. I definitely. We've been talking about doing a show for quite some time, probably in the tri-state area, but we're also going to be at the Berkshire Podcast Festival in October. And so this is a great opportunity for people to come and meet us to, say hi and possibly do a meetup, which I know that we will likely do. And we'll announce that as it gets closer to the actual event.
Yes, Meghan, the event is scheduled for October 18th to October 20th. We'll be posting more information. But for now, if you're interested in coming, you could use our promo code to save 35% on all tickets. And there's different levels of tickets that you can find on the Berkshire Podcast website. Our promo code is WOMEN2024. That's WOMEN 2024.
We hope to see you all there.
Yes, we do. And thank you so much for that question. Thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to catching you next time on Women in Crime.
Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Seiler, Burr and Jose Alfonso. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime.
Sources for today's episode include Minds on Trial by Charles Patrick Ewing and Joseph McCann, Cornell University, Psychiatric Times, Harvard.com, Justia Law, Lawline Blog, Psychology Today, and Tarasoff versus Regents of the University of California.